When I was about 14, the thing we looked forward to most once school was out for the summer was camping. We didn't go with our parents or through some program. We'd just pack up our gear, throw some food and whatever fishing stuff we could carry into backpacks or old duffel bags, and head out to a small spot on the lake not too far from one of my friend's houses. His house sat at the edge of a patch of woods, and if you walked maybe half a mile through the trees, you'd hit this little inlet on the lake that had a clearing just big enough to pitch a couple of tents. The lake itself wasn't huge, but it stretched long in both directions, with overgrown shoreline and broken up patches of rocky beach. On a still night, you could hear voices from way across the water if someone was out fishing or setting up camp, but mostly it was quiet. There were 4 of us who went out there pretty often that summer. My buddy Luke was the one who lived closest to the spot, and then there was me, Tanner, and Chris. We'd haul out sleeping bags, little cook stoves, snacks, drinks, and sometimes we'd even lug out an old cooler packed with sandwiches or cans of soda. It was always a little bit of a pain walking through the woods with our stuff, but it felt like the start of something exciting every time, like we were really out in the wild. The spot was perfect for us. It was hidden, quiet, and just open enough to see the stars when you lay back on your sleeping bag at night. We'd fish during the day, swim a little if it wasn't too cold, and sit around the fire in the evenings until it died out. Sometimes we'd tell stories. Sometimes we'd just stare at the fire and listen to the insects buzzing around us or the sound of frogs coming from the reeds. We felt completely cut off from everything else in a good way. The night I'll never forget wasn't really that different from the others at first. We'd gotten out there in the afternoon, maybe around 4, and set up camp like usual. 2 small dome tents, one for Luke and Chris, and the other for me and Tanner. We had a fire going before the sun went down and managed to catch a couple of decent-sized fish that we cooked up over the flames. We didn't talk about much, just the usual stuff, school, dumb things we saw online, whose older brother was the biggest idiot. That kind of thing. Once it got dark, we sat there for a while, passing around a bag of marshmallows and trying to scare each other with half-baked stories. Eventually, we turned in. It must have been close to midnight. The fire had burned down to embers, and we were all tired from walking and fishing all day. I remember lying in the tent and staring up at the faint pattern of the nylon above me, listening to the soft sounds of the woods. Some insects, the occasional splash out on the water. That part always made me feel safe for some reason, like nature had a rhythm you could count on. I don't know how long I was asleep before I woke up. Maybe an hour, maybe more, but I remember the sound that pulled me out of sleep. It was a dull thud, almost like something soft but solid had hit the ground nearby. At first, I thought maybe an animal had walked through camp and knocked something over, but then another thud came and this one hit the tent. It wasn't a twig or a pine cone or anything like that. It was heavy. I heard it land right near my feet, and it bounced. I could feel it through the thin floor of the tent. Then there was another one, and another. The pattern was irregular, like whoever or whatever was throwing these things wasn't standing in one spot. I sat up slowly, still half asleep, and looked over at Tanner, who was doing the same. We didn't say anything. We just sat there, wide-eyed, listening as more objects hit the tent. Some bouncing off the nylon with dull thumps, others landing nearby in the dirt with quiet thuds. I unzipped my sleeping bag and sat there, heart pounding. My first thought was maybe it was a prank. Someone from school might have followed us out there to screw with us. But then the rocks started hitting harder. One bounced off the top of the tent and rolled down the side, and when it hit the ground, it made a sound I still remember, like 2 pieces of firewood hitting each other. It wasn't small. It had to be the size of a golf ball, maybe even bigger. Then a rock hit hard enough to cave the side of the tent in slightly before bouncing off. Tanner looked like he was about to unzip the door and rush out, but I grabbed his arm and shook my head. We just sat there, frozen, not knowing what the hell was going on. Outside, the sounds continued. The rocks were definitely coming from more than one direction. It wasn't just someone tossing a few pebbles and running off. It felt like a pattern, like someone or multiple people were surrounding the tent and taking turns. After what felt like 5 or 10 minutes, the sound stopped. Complete silence.
No footsteps. No voices.
Not even the usual insects or frogs. Everything went quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your ears ring a little. Then, Out of nowhere, a scream came from down the shoreline. It wasn't loud like it was right next to us, but it wasn't far off either. A few hundred yards, maybe. It sounded like a woman or maybe a kid, yelling once. Just one long, high-pitched scream that echoed across the water and bounced through the trees. The kind of scream that makes your chest tighten up instantly. After that, nothing. Just silence again. Dead still. We sat there, still not moving. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Eventually, I must have dozed off from pure exhaustion because the next thing I remember is waking up to sunlight filtering through the side of the tent. I rubbed my eyes and sat up, trying to convince myself the night before had been some kind of dream. When we got out of the tent, Chris and Luke were already up, standing near the fire pit with these stiff, blank expressions. The area around the tent was littered with rocks. Not pebbles, real rocks. Some of them were the size of softballs, others about the size of your fist. One had even landed hard enough to leave a small dent in the side of our cooler. Then we found the fishing pole. It was Luke's. He always brought the same one. A decent rod that he'd gotten from his older cousin. It was lying on the ground just a few feet from our tent, snapped in two places. The handle was splintered near the reel, and the upper section was cleanly broken near the tip. We all just stared at it for a few seconds, not really saying anything. That broke any doubt we had about what happened. If it had been friends playing a joke, they wouldn't have broken the rod. That thing meant a lot to Luke, and anyone who knew him would have known that. Plus, the fact that it was broken meant someone had been close. Right there, walking around our campsite at night while we were sleeping, throwing rocks, snapping gear. None of us said it out loud, but we all felt the same thing. Whoever had been out there knew we were there, and they didn't care if they scared us. That wasn't just some prank. That was someone trying to send a message, or maybe just enjoying messing with a bunch of kids too much. We packed up quick that morning. None of the usual dragging it out or hanging around the fire to cook breakfast. We just got our gear together and walked back to Luke's house as fast as we could without running. We didn't talk about it much for the rest of the day either. His parents weren't home when we got there, and none of us felt like explaining it to anyone anyway. Felt too weird, too hard to explain without sounding stupid. But here's the crazy thing. That wasn't the last time we went camping there. It wasn't even the last time that summer. Something about being kids. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe we just convinced ourselves it had to be a fluke. We kept going back. A few weeks passed and we ended up back out at that same spot. Same path, same tents, same lake. The rocks didn't come back. Not that time. Not the time after that either. But every time we went back, I felt it. That edge in the back of my mind. That weird, buzzing nervousness. I never slept the same way again when we camped. I'd wake up at every small sound. I'd check to make sure the fishing poles were where we left them. I'd sit up in the middle of the night and just listen, waiting for that first thud. It never came again. Not while I was a kid anyway, but that night stuck with me. Not because of the rocks or the scream or the broken pole. It stuck with me because of the way it felt. Like we were being watched. Like someone was out there just beyond the tree line and we never saw them. They didn't want to hurt us. Not really. If they did, they could have done more. But they wanted us scared. And we were. Every second of it. Looking back on it now, as an adult, I still don't have a clean answer. It could have been someone who lived nearby, a drifter, maybe some teenagers older than us screwing around and not thinking twice about how it would land. But it felt like more than that. It felt like someone had planned it out. Like it wasn't their first time doing it. We never caught anyone. Never saw anyone. And the memory faded over time. Life moved on, we got older, and eventually stopped camping there altogether. But even now, sometimes when I hear a sound outside my house at night, a crack, a thud, something hitting the ground, I get that same tight feeling in my chest. That reminder, not everything out there wants to hurt you. Some things just want to scare you enough to never come back. And some of them succeed. When I was about 16, my cousin and I started going on longer camping trips without adults. We both had decent experience in the woods. His dad was into hunting, mine was into fishing, and between us we knew enough to build fires, navigate trails, and pack what we needed for a few nights in the wild. We lived in Western Washington, not far from the Cascades, and we had endless options for places to camp. There was one spot in particular we liked. It wasn't on any map. His uncle had told him about it. You had to drive about an hour past the last paved road, down a dirt logging road, then park and hike in for another 30 minutes. Once you reached the ridge, there was a steep slope that dropped to a large clearing surrounded by heavy forest. A shallow creek ran through the far end, and there were signs deer came through often. It was quiet, far away from people, and didn't get cell service. We'd camped there twice before, both times in the summer. But that year we went in late September, just before the first real cold of fall set in. The days were still warm, but the nights dropped into the low 40s. It meant fewer bugs, and the creek water was cleaner from recent rains. We got there late morning, set up the tent near the edge of the clearing, with the entrance facing the creek. We built a small fire ring with rocks, gathered wood, and boiled some water to purify it. We spent the rest of the afternoon walking around, scouting for animal tracks and checking for downed trees or branches that might fall during the night. I remember thinking how quiet it felt. There were birds, but not many. Even the wind seemed to move slower through the trees that day. Around sunset, we cooked some canned stew over the fire and just sat there eating and watching the flames. The fire gave off that dry, crackling heat that soaks into your clothes. The forest around us was dimming fast. You could still see the outline of the trees, but the detail was gone. No stars yet, just a heavy stretch of navy sky. We talked for a bit, then turned in not long after dark. We slept in separate sleeping bags inside a two-person tent. The ground was flat but firm. I laid there for a while listening to the wind, which had picked up a little. I heard a few dry leaves skittering and an owl off in the distance. Eventually, I drifted off. I woke up in the middle of the night. No idea what time it was. It was cold enough that I pulled the sleeping bag over my head. Everything was dark. No moon, no light leaking through the tent walls. I was about to try to fall back asleep when I heard what I thought was a branch snapping nearby. It wasn't loud, just a clean, sharp crack, like someone stepping on a twig. I figured it was a deer or maybe a raccoon. Then I heard something heavier. It wasn't walking fast, but it was big, and it was moving slow, one step at a time, circling around the clearing. I could hear the sound of weight pressing into the soft soil, followed by light crunches of dry brush underfoot. My cousin didn't move. I don't know if he was awake or still out. I lay completely still, listening. The steps weren't random. They were steady, deliberate, like someone pacing a perimeter. Then they stopped. I waited, not breathing. After a long moment, I heard another branch snap, closer this time. It felt like the sound had moved behind the tent. Then there was nothing again, just silence and the faintest whistle of wind. Suddenly, something hit the side of the tent. It wasn't violent, more like a nudge, but it was unmistakable. A palm, or something flat, touched the back wall and pressed lightly. Felt like a slow, curious push, not a strike. My chest tightened so much I could barely breathe. I didn't dare move. The pressure stayed for maybe 3 seconds, then lifted. There was more shuffling outside, the sound of something walking just a few feet from us. Then, after a pause, it started to walk away. I listened until I couldn't hear the steps anymore. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, the tent was still standing. No signs of damage. We got out and looked around. About 30 feet behind the tent, we found something that stopped both of us cold. There was a footprint, a single, deep print in the soft mud. It wasn't a boot print or a shoe. It was barefoot, 5 toes, wide at the ball and long, maybe 14 inches from heel to toe. It had to be fresh. The edges were still sharp. We didn't say much, just stared at it, then looked at each other. We checked the rest of the clearing, but there were no more prints. Whatever it was, it had stepped in just the right spot to leave that one clear track. We stayed one more night. I don't know why. Maybe because we didn't want to seem scared, or maybe we thought lightning wouldn't strike twice. We went to bed early, didn't even light a fire. Just laid there in the dark, quiet. Nothing happened that night.
No sounds.
No movement, just cold, heavy stillness. After that trip, we didn't go back to that spot again. A few years later, I brought it up with my cousin. He admitted he hadn't really slept that first night either. He'd heard the steps, heard the tent being touched. He just didn't want to say anything and make it worse. Now, over a decade later, I still think about it sometimes. It wasn't a bear. I've seen bear tracks before. They don't walk upright in a circle, and they don't press a hand flat against a tent wall. That footprint was real. Too real to ignore. It looked human, but too big, too heavy. Whatever it was, it watched us for a long time before walking away. I've told a few people the story over the years. Some think I'm joking. Some try to explain it away as a prank or a dream. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. Somewhere out in those woods, something was watching us. And it didn't want to hurt us. Not that night, anyway. But it wanted us to know we weren't alone. That was the last time I ever camped in a place that remote. These days, I stick to marked trails, state parks, anywhere other people might be nearby. I still love the outdoors, but I've never forgotten that night. The cold, the silence, the slow, heavy steps circling our tent, and that single footprint in the mud. The woods never gave me an answer, just a memory that's never left me since. I've always loved camping, especially in the fall when the air turns cool and crisp and the bugs die down. Shenandoah National Park had been on my list for years. I'd seen pictures of the Blue Ridge Mountains during peak color, and it always looked like something off a postcard. That year, we finally made it happen. My husband and I set aside a long weekend in October and made the drive down from Northern Virginia, winding through the hills with the windows cracked open and the smell of leaves thick in the air. We had reserved a campsite near the base of the mountain, in a semi-primitive area that allowed for fires and had a flat clearing for tents. The site was well off the main campground, and that was the appeal. No crowds, no generators, no car doors slamming at all hours, just forest and quiet. We parked the car at the lot and hiked in about half a mile with our packs, which wasn't too bad except for the last stretch. The ground there was covered in wet leaves and a bit slick underfoot. Once we reached the clearing, I felt good about the spot. The forest was thick all around, but the campsite itself was open and dry, with a small fire ring already set up from previous campers. We took our time setting up the tent, stacking wood, and clearing the area of anything sharp or wet. The sun dipped early behind the ridgeline, and the temperature dropped fast. By the time we'd finished dinner, it was already chilly enough that I could see my breath if I stepped away from the fire. We sat around the fire for a couple hours. My husband drank a beer, and I sipped some tea from the old camp mug I always bring with me. We listened to the sounds of the woods, the crack of a branch far off, the rustling of leaves in a light breeze, the soft rhythmic clicking of a few insects toughing it out this late in the season. We went to bed early, probably around 9. My husband fell asleep almost immediately. He's always been able to pass out anywhere, anytime. I, on the other hand, take a while. Laying in that tent, I could feel every little sound around us. I heard acorns dropping, some distance off. Then a light breeze rolled down through the trees and brushed against the sides of the tent. The nylon flapped slightly. I closed my eyes and told myself to relax. There was nothing out there that hadn't been out there every other night we'd camped before. But maybe an hour later, I woke up to a very distinct sound. Huffing. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. My husband was snoring gently beside me, the slow, rhythmic breath that came from deep sleep. I held mine, listening. Then I heard it again, a heavy exhale, followed by another. Then what sounded like a footstep. Close. Too close. I sat upright in my sleeping bag, my heartbeat suddenly strong in my ears. It was definitely outside the tent, no more than a few feet away. A heavy, moist breath. Not a growl, not aggressive, but animal. Something sniffing, something alive and right there. My first thought was bear. We'd seen plenty of signs at the trailhead warning us to store our food properly, and I had made absolutely sure we'd hung our bag well away from the tent. Still, I'd heard stories of black bears being bold in fall, trying to fatten up before winter. I didn't have a flashlight handy, and I didn't want to make noise digging for it. I sat frozen, hoping the thing would move on. Another huff, then something brushed the side of the tent, Not hard, but like a nose or shoulder had bumped it. I could hear my husband snoring. Still asleep, I wanted to shake him, but I was too afraid any movement would provoke whatever was out there. I stayed perfectly still, every muscle tight. Then came the footsteps, a light crunch of leaf litter and pine needles, circling the tent slowly. Whatever it was wasn't in a hurry. It walked a full loop around us, pausing every few steps to sniff, to breathe in that loud, thick way animals do when they're investigating something. I must have sat there for an hour, unmoving, listening. It circled 3 or 4 times, stopping sometimes right next to the tent wall. Once, I heard a snort and what sounded like a stomp. I was sure it was about to tear open the fabric, and my body felt like a block of ice. But it never did. Eventually, the steps grew softer. The huffing moved off. And then, finally, there was silence again. I didn't sleep after that. Not a single minute. I lay there in the dark until the faint light of morning started to filter through the thin nylon walls. My husband stirred around 7, sat up, stretched, looked over at me and said I looked like hell. I just nodded. We got out of the tent, and the first thing I did was scan the ground around us. That's when I saw the droppings. Piles of them in 2 different spots. I'm no expert, but I know enough to recognize deer scat when I see it. Round, pellet-like, clumped up just a few feet from the tent. I saw more near the edge of the clearing, along with clear prints in the damp earth. Deer. A whole group of them from the looks of it. That's when it hit me. The sound I'd heard, the huffing, the stomping. It hadn't been a bear at all. It was deer, probably curious about the smell of our food or the salt from our sweat. Maybe even rutting season making them more bold and unpredictable. I'd spent the entire night frozen in fear of something that, in daylight, seemed totally harmless. It almost made me laugh, but my body still felt shaky. The thing is, even though it turned out to be deer, the fear I felt was real. When you're lying in a dark tent, hearing something big move just inches from your head, your brain doesn't care about facts. It goes straight to survival mode. Your heart races, your breath shortens. You're sure the next sound will be your last. We packed up slowly that morning. I took extra time folding the tent, looking out into the woods. There's something unsettling about knowing how close wild animals can get without you even realizing. It makes the forest feel less like a peaceful escape and more like a place where you're always being watched. We still camp, but I haven't been back to that spot in Shenandoah. Not because it was dangerous, but because I think part of me doesn't want to relive that night. The fear, the waiting, the sound of something circling just outside the thin wall of fabric that separated me from whatever was out there. Even now, when we go camping, I listen a little more carefully. I keep the flashlight within reach, and when I hear a branch snap or a breath in the dark, I remember that night at the bottom of the mountain, when I sat up alone in the tent, convinced a bear was outside, while my husband snored peacefully beside me. It wasn't a bear, just deer, but in the dark, with nothing but your ears to guide you, anything can feel like a predator, and sometimes not knowing for sure is worse than the truth. I'd been camping alone up north for a few days, somewhere along a wide valley cut between stretches of pine-covered ridges. I wasn't exactly remote. There were others camped here and there in the area, but it was quiet and open enough to feel like I had space. It was late spring, and the nights still held on to a chill that settled over everything just before dawn. My site was set up on a little rise maybe 20 yards from the lake's edge, flat ground with a decent view of the shoreline and the low hills that framed it. Every morning, I made a habit of waking early. Something about that quiet just before sunrise pulled me out of my sleeping bag like a reflex. I'd throw on a hoodie, unzip the tent as slowly as I could to not break the silence, and sit just outside with my little camping stove and a tin mug. I wouldn't even bother cooking right away. I just liked sitting there with coffee in hand, steam curling out into the crisp air, listening to the lake breathe while everything was still soft and dim. It was on my 4th morning there that things got strange. Not terrifying in the sense that I ever felt in real danger, but strange in that primal, uncomfortable way where something in your brain realizes you're not the one in control. Not even close. There was another camper across the clearing from me. A guy maybe in his 50s set up on the flatter part of the field, closer to the trees. I hadn't spoken to him. We were doing that silent nod and mind your business thing that solo campers tend to do, but I'd seen him around his fire in the evenings. He had a small dome tent and one of those collapsible cots that sits a foot or two off the ground. He'd gone to sleep early the night before, probably just after sunset. I hadn't seen any light from his site after dark. That morning, I was sitting with my coffee as usual. It was cold enough that I could see my breath, but not so cold that I minded. The clouds were low, and everything had that blue-gray tint that happens before the light really starts to push through. I was staring at the lake, halfway zoned out, when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. 2 moose were coming out of the tree line. At first, I thought I was imagining it. They moved so slowly, just big hulking shadows against the darker trees. They walked like they owned the place, calm, heavy, and with that sort of clumsy grace big animals have when they know they don't have to be afraid of much. I froze. Not out of fear exactly, but I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I stayed there, holding my mug halfway to my face, trying to keep my breathing quiet. They walked right across the clearing, angled slightly toward the other man's campsite. I could hear the crackling of twigs under their hooves, the soft snorting sounds they made now and then. Moose are huge. It's easy to forget that if you've only seen them in photos. These 2 were adults. One was noticeably larger than the other, likely a cow and her yearling. Still, that yearling was bigger than any deer I'd ever seen, and the cow was tall enough that her head could easily look through a car window without needing to bend down. They didn't seem to care about me. They didn't even look in my direction. Their path was straight toward the other tent. The guy was still asleep, or at least not moving. His cot was set up right at the mouth of his tent's vestibule, so he was only covered by a thin flap of mesh. It probably felt cooler that way during the night, but that meant he was essentially sleeping with his face out in the open. I watched as the cow moose came right up to the edge of his camp. She stopped a few feet from him and leaned her massive head forward. She sniffed the air. Her ears twitched back and forth. Her lips moved slightly, the way a horse's would, and then, without hesitation, she lowered her nose right to his face. I felt my stomach twist. He woke up then. Slowly, I saw him blink. He didn't bolt upright or scream or anything. He just sort of realized something was wrong. His eyes moved. Then he went still, just like I had. His whole body froze on the cot, barely a foot away from the moose's face. She kept sniffing, huffing. I could hear it even from where I was sitting. Big bursts of breath, wet and heavy. Her ears flicked again, and she shifted her weight from one leg to the other. The yearling was just behind her, swaying a bit like it was bored. He didn't move. I don't know how he kept still. I could feel my heart pounding just from watching. After maybe 30 seconds, which felt way longer than that, the cow pulled her head back slightly. She gave one last snort and turned away. Just like that, she started walking again, past his tent and toward the trees at the other end of the clearing. The yearling followed. I stayed still until they were fully gone. The other guy didn't move either. Eventually, he sat up. Slowly. He looked around, saw me, and just gave a nod. We didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. The rest of the day felt weird. Not bad, just unsettled. I went about my usual stuff, boiled more water, made some food, read a bit, but that feeling never went away. The idea that something that big could walk right into camp, get that close, and then leave like it didn't matter, like we were just part of the background. Later that afternoon, the man across the field packed up and left. I didn't blame him. I stayed one more night, but I didn't sleep well. Every snap of a twig or gust of wind made my body tense. I kept picturing that massive head hovering inches above my face. The next morning, I left too. It wasn't fear that drove me off, not exactly. It was more like humility, a reminder that we're not really in charge out there. We bring our gear, pitch our tents, boil our water, and pretend we're claiming a spot for a while. But we're just guests, visitors borrowing space. That clearing didn't belong to us. And some mornings, the real owners stop by to remind you of that. I've camped a lot since then, still do, but I always remember that morning, that stillness, that moment where a giant animal decided, without hesitation, to step into our world for a minute and then step back out like it didn't matter. I think that's what really stuck with me. Not the fear, not the size, but the quiet confidence of a creature that knew it didn't have to ask permission. Every time I go out now, I carry that image with me, not as a warning, but as a lesson. Nature isn't something we can ever fully control or predict. It just is. And sometimes, it leans in close enough for you to feel its breath on your face, just to see what you'll do. I've camped a lot in my life. Ever since I was a teenager, I've always found something peaceful about sleeping outdoors. The slow build of light in the morning, the dry scent of pine and dirt, the sound of birds waking up before you do, it always gave me a sort of peace I couldn't find at home. But the night I heard mountain lions fighting just beyond the tree line completely changed the way I feel about being in the wilderness. This happened about 6 years ago. A group of friends and I had planned a long weekend camping trip in the mountains in late spring. The location was a quiet backcountry spot, somewhere off a fire road that only those with good clearance vehicles could reach. No ranger station nearby, no campsites with those metal numbers or picnic tables. Just raw forest, a slow-running stream, and enough flat ground for a couple tents. I had hiked in the day before to get things set up while my friends staggered their arrivals. I always liked getting the lay of the land first. It was peaceful up there. Temperatures dropped fast once the sun ducked behind the hills, but the air was clean and I remember the wind rustling just enough to keep the mosquitoes down. I had a little campfire going, a hot meal in my stomach, and I watched the light drain from the sky while sipping on a cheap camping whiskey. It was a good first evening. Quiet. By the next afternoon, 4 of us had set up camp. 2 tents, a makeshift kitchen area near the fire, and a separate spot about 50 yards out where we kept anything scented, food, deodorant, toothpaste, in a bare bag slung over a tree limb. We had seen no signs of anything big out there. No tracks, no scat, nothing obvious. Just squirrels, birds, and one curious doe that got spooked when we started chopping wood. That night, we sat around the fire for hours, talking, laughing, sipping beers, just soaking in the stillness. It was one of those great camping nights when everything feels perfect. No drama, no bad weather, no gear failures. Just good company and the quiet of the woods. We turned in around 11, maybe midnight. I was tired and fell asleep fast. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. The fire was long gone, and the tent was completely dark. At first, I thought I just heard a branch fall, or maybe one of my friends moving around. I lay still, trying to figure out if the sound that woke me was real or part of a dream. That's when I heard it again. Started off like a growl, low, guttural. Then it built into something I can only describe as a scream, but not like anything a human could make. It was the kind of noise that instantly floods your system with adrenaline. A primal, blood-freezing sound. I froze. I wasn't even sure I was breathing. The scream grew louder, sharper. Then came another scream, just as terrifying, from what sounded like a different animal. They were close, within a couple 100 feet, I'd guess, maybe less. It sounded like something being torn apart. Each scream sounded like pain and fury tangled together. I lay there in my sleeping bag, every muscle tense. My mind started racing through what I knew about mountain lions. They're stealthy, solitary. They attack from behind. They scream like women being murdered. Everything I had ever read or heard came flooding back to me. My mouth went dry. The sounds of the fight moved around, maybe 30 feet in one direction, then back the other way. A crashing sound in the brush. More screaming. I remember realizing I could hear one of them panting. Deep, angry exhales, like whatever it was had spent itself in a violent frenzy. I knew there was no way I was unzipping that tent. I didn't want to breathe too loud. I didn't want to shift in my sleeping bag. I remember trying to make myself smaller, as if curling into a ball would somehow make me less noticeable. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. That's not a figure of speech. It was literally the loudest thing I could hear at that moment. Eventually, the screaming stopped. No more growling, no crashing brush, just the wind and the trees again. But there was no way I was going back to sleep. I lay there for hours, just staring up at the nylon ceiling of my tent. I felt like something was still out there, watching. I imagined eyes in the dark, the way cats' eyes glow when headlights hit them. I kept thinking if I fell asleep, I'd wake up with one of them inside the tent. Irrational, sure, but fear doesn't care about logic in moments like that. Around dawn, I heard birds again. That helped. The first gray light started to creep in, and I finally unzipped the tent and sat up. The air was cold. My breath fogged in front of me. I looked around, half expecting to see claw marks on a tree or blood on the forest floor, but there was nothing. Just the peaceful forest again, like nothing had happened. One of my friends, who had camped a short way off in a hammock setup, came walking into camp with a mug of coffee in his hand and this big grin on his face. He asked if I'd heard the mountain lions during the night, said it was one of the coolest things he'd ever heard. I remember just nodding. I didn't feel like arguing, but inside, I was still wound tight with tension. Later, after breakfast, I walked off by myself a little, trying to track where the fight might have happened. I didn't find anything. No blood, no fur, not even clear prints. The forest had a way of covering things quickly, but I knew what I'd heard. I don't know if it was two males fighting over territory, or a female being pursued, or a kill, or something else. All I know is that I'd never felt fear like that before. That day, I thought a lot about the difference between appreciating nature and being a part of it. When you hear something like that, something that raw and violent, you remember that you're not at the top of the food chain out there. You're a guest, and not always a welcome one. You remember that the woods don't care about your plans or your tent or your cozy sleeping bag. Out there, everything survives or doesn't, and it doesn't always make a sound you can forget. We finished the trip, but I didn't sleep well the next night either. Every little twig crack made me flinch. Every gust of wind sounded like breathing. It was a long weekend, and I was glad to get home. I didn't talk much about it when we got back. When people ask me about that trip, I usually tell them it was just quiet and beautiful, and that we were lucky with the weather. But I think about that night often. It's the sound that stays with me. That scream, louder and more horrifying than anything I've ever heard. Camping still means something to me, but I don't go as deep into the backcountry now. I like places where there's a ranger station nearby. I keep a knife closer to me when I sleep. I take the fear seriously now. That night reminded me that the wild is still wild, no matter how peaceful it might seem when the sun's out. And no matter how quiet the forest gets, you never really know what's watching from the dark. I was working for Ontario Parks the summer after my second year in university. It wasn't a job I had applied for with high hopes, more like something that lined up well with the school calendar and paid better than most retail gigs. I'd grown up in southern Ontario, so I'd been around enough forests and provincial parks to know the general vibe. It was peaceful. There were busy days, sure, but most of the time it was about keeping things running smooth. People in, people out, nobody getting hurt, nothing catching fire. I was posted at the front gate for most of the summer, eventually promoted to head gate attendant after the first guy quit 2 weeks in. It didn't mean much except I was the one who picked up the phone when it rang and did more of the opening and closing shifts. By mid-July, the park was in full swing. Long weekends meant back-to-back check-ins, and the phone almost never stopped ringing. Lost campers, drunk campers, people complaining about noise, people asking about the weather like I had a direct line to Environment Canada. It was what it was. You just got used to it. The park itself was relatively quiet compared to some of the other ones I'd heard about. We had a good layout, well-spaced sites, and enough forest cover to give everyone a bit of privacy. There was a main road that looped through the park and several side loops where the campsites were laid out. Site numbers were stenciled onto wooden posts and the pads were gravel, mostly flat. Pretty standard. There were washroom buildings every so often, some with actual plumbing, others just vault toilets. Most evenings went by with little trouble, but now and then you'd get something odd. I remember the call came in on a Sunday night. It was close to 9 p.m. Not quite dark yet, but the sun was definitely down behind the trees. I was the only one in the gatehouse, sitting with my feet up, checking over the reservation list for the next day. The phone rang and I picked it up like I always did. I still remember how casual the guy sounded. He just said, "Hey, there's a couple of cougars fighting at the site across from us. Oh well, that's it. That was his tone. Like he was calling about a raccoon tipping over a garbage can or a squirrel stealing chips. I even laughed a little when I hung up, thinking it was a joke. The word cougar had that double meaning, and I honestly thought that's what he meant. I figured maybe some older women were yelling at each other over a stolen lawn chair or a burned marshmallow or whatever. I even imagined them with big sunglasses and wine tumblers, clawing at each other while their husbands watched awkwardly. But something about the way he'd said it lingered with me. It wasn't the words. It was the timing. It was late. It was quiet outside. The park had that stillness that only comes after a long day when all the campers are settled. The kids are tucked into sleeping bags, and the fires are burning low. I radioed my supervisor, who was also the park warden that night. He was off duty, but still close by in one of the staff cabins. I just mentioned it in passing. Hey, someone called in about cougars fighting over on Loop C. But the word cougar to him didn't mean what it meant to me. His mind went to actual animals. Cougars? He asked, and I could hear the shift in his voice. I mean, probably not, I said. It's probably a joke, but maybe something's going on. He told me to hang tight and that he'd be by in a couple of minutes. When he rolled up in one of the park trucks, he had the bear bangers with him. Those were small explosive cartridges we carried for scaring off large animals. Bears mostly, but sometimes moose or wolves. We didn't use them often, but you had to know how to. If you used them wrong or too close, you could seriously hurt yourself or someone else. Used right, they made enough noise to wake the dead. I hopped in and we drove out toward the site the caller had mentioned. It was a bit deeper in one of the quieter loops. That part of the park backed onto thicker forest. There were fewer people around, and the sites weren't booked up like the ones closer to the lake. As we approached, we turned off the headlights so we wouldn't blind anyone. Just used the parking lights. The gravel crunched under the tires, loud in the stillness. We parked near the washroom building and walked the rest of the way in. I had my flashlight out, though I kept it off for the most part. We didn't want to spook anyone or make a scene. If it really was just two people arguing, we'd talk to them and move on. We crept along the tree line toward the site the guy had mentioned. I didn't hear anything at first. No yelling, no laughter, no noise at all, which struck me as weird considering how casual the call had been. Then, maybe 10 or 15 feet from the site's clearing, we both stopped at the same time. There was a noise. It wasn't human. It was deep and guttural, like a rasping growl mixed with a screech. It was fast and high-pitched, like a scream that trailed off into a snarl. And then there was another one. Something snapped. A branch, maybe. Then a thud. Then silence. Then another growl, even closer. It was right there in the trees, maybe 10 feet ahead of us, just past the site. I couldn't see them yet, but I knew we weren't dealing with people. We stepped forward slowly. My supervisor raised the bear banger launcher and loaded a cartridge. I kept my flashlight off until he whispered to turn it on. I clicked it. 2 bobcats. I'd never seen them that close before. I'd heard about them, sure. Read the pamphlets, seen the wildlife signs. But I had never looked into the eyes of a wild animal that wasn't running away from me. They weren't running. They were facing each other, about 5 feet apart, hunched low, shoulders up, tails flicking. One of them had a rip in its ear. The other was slightly smaller, but its fur was bristled and its teeth were showing. Their pupils were huge in the beam of the flashlight, and their mouths hung open as they made these insane screeching sounds at each other. They looked like demons. I'm not exaggerating. In that moment, I forgot all about the joke, all about the guy who'd called. I was just frozen there, flashlight in hand, breathing shallow, waiting to see what would happen. Then one of them lunged. They collided hard, rolling in the dirt and leaves, hissing and biting and clawing. It wasn't graceful. It was like watching 2 house cats in a life or death struggle, only twice the size and with a hell of a lot more muscle. The noise was unbearable. I flinched as they slammed against a picnic table, knocking it sideways. That's when my supervisor fired the first bear banger. It exploded with a bright flash and a deafening bang, echoing through the trees like a gunshot. The cats froze. One bolted immediately, disappearing into the underbrush with a blur of fur. The other hesitated for half a second, then followed, crashing through the woods toward the lake. Silence again. We just stood there, the smoke from the bear banger hanging in the air like mist. The picnic table was on its side. The fire pit was scattered with dirt and gravel, and there were scratch marks in the dust around it. No campers were in the sight across the road. It looked like they'd packed up or gone for a walk or something. We radioed back to confirm the site status and found out it was only partially occupied. Some guy and his girlfriend, who were apparently out for an evening paddle. That was it. No one was hurt. No gear was damaged, at least not that we could see. We filled out a report when we got back. No big incident, just a wildlife encounter that didn't escalate. But it became a thing. The next morning, the staff cabin was buzzing with the story. My co-workers wouldn't let it go. The term cougar fight became shorthand for any kind of chaos. At some point, one of the other attendants got a guest to call in with a fake report. Yeah, there's a couple of middle-aged smoke shows fighting in the site across from us. I didn't even blink. I just said, "I'll inform animal control," and hung up. It was funny, yeah, but also it stuck with me because it could have gone a lot worse. If we'd rolled up in that truck without the bear bangers, if we'd gotten between them somehow, if there had been kids in that site, any number of things could have gone wrong. And those sounds they made, I've heard a lot of things in the woods since then, but nothing like that. Nothing that primal. Nothing that raw. It changed how I looked at the job. I wasn't just a student punching a clock anymore. I was the first line of response. I was the one picking up the phone, and I had to take it seriously. For the rest of that summer, I never brushed off a report again, no matter how dumb it sounded. I never assumed it was a joke, even when it obviously was. Because once in a while, it's not. Once in a while, it's two wild animals tearing into each other 10 feet from a family's tent. And that's not something you forget. I've always loved the woods. There's something about being out there, really out there, that made everything else feel quiet. When I was younger, back when I still lived in North Carolina, I'd take off into the Pisgah National Forest on the weekends and set up camp away from everyone else. I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, I preferred it. I liked the sound of the wind through the trees, the crunch of leaves under my boots, the flicker of a fire, and the way the air got cooler as the sun dipped behind the ridges. Back then, I wasn't really afraid of anything out in the woods. We had bobcats around, but they were barely larger than some house cats. Scrawny things, skittish too. I never saw one up close that didn't bolt the second it noticed me. I figured if it ever came to it, I could punt one like a football if it tried something. The idea of being seriously threatened by something out there just didn't feel real to me. I didn't carry bear spray, didn't worry about snakes much, and I sure as hell didn't worry about cougars or mountain lions. I didn't even believe they were around anymore. You'd hear a guy in a bar say he saw one, or you'd hear some old hunter talk about spotting a tail disappearing into the trees 30 years ago, but no one had real proof. That was before that one trip changed my mind for good. It was early October, the kind of time when the nights start getting that sharp edge to them and the trees are all fire-colored. I packed my old 60-liter pack and loaded up the truck for a 2-night solo out along a stretch of trail that branched off near Linville Gorge. I'd done it once before, and I remembered a small clearing a good 5 miles in where the trees thinned and the ground leveled out nice. I had no plans except to make it to that spot, set up my tent, and just enjoy the quiet. I parked at the gravel lot just after noon and started walking in. The trail was mostly empty. I passed a pair of hikers about a mile in, but after that it was just me and the woods. The air smelled like pine needles and dry leaves, and every so often I'd hear acorns falling from the oaks overhead. I made it to the spot around 3, a little sweaty from the uphill sections but otherwise fine. I took my time setting up camp. Tent first, then I gathered some dry wood nearby and set up a fire ring. I knew it would get cold that night, and I liked the light and crackle of a fire anyway. Dinner was simple, instant rice, a pouch of chicken, a bit of seasoning. I sat on a log near the fire and watched the sun go down through the trees, sipping from a little flask of whiskey I'd brought along. The night got still and quiet like it always does out there, and I remember thinking it was almost too quiet. I could hear the blood in my ears, the occasional pop of the fire, and nothing else. No crickets, no owls, no wind. I brushed it off. Sometimes the woods are like that. I turned in early, maybe 9 or so. The temperature had dropped fast, and I curled into my sleeping bag, pulled the drawstring tight, and drifted off. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was still pitch black out. Cold too, real cold. I figured I needed to take a piss, so I unzipped the bag, pulled on my jacket, and grabbed the flashlight from beside me. I stepped out of the tent, my boots crunching frost that had formed on the dead leaves. That's when I heard it. It was faint at first, a kind of low growl off in the distance. I froze. I turned the flashlight in the direction of the sound, but couldn't see anything. The growl came again, a little louder this time, and this time it was followed by a sound I'd never heard before, like a scream, but not human. It was high-pitched and piercing and seemed to go on for a few seconds too long. It stopped as fast as it started. I stood there for a full minute, not moving, just scanning the trees with my light, trying to convince myself it was a fox or something, maybe even 2 animals fighting. Still, it didn't sit right with me. I'd heard bobcats before. They can sound creepy, sure, but this wasn't that. This was deeper, more powerful. I went back in the tent and zipped it up tight. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. Every little noise made my eyes snap open. I kept my light in one hand and a fixed-blade knife in the other under the sleeping bag. Nothing happened, but I didn't get more than a couple hours of rest. When the sun came up, I got out of the tent and walked around the perimeter of my site. I didn't see anything out of place. No prints, no scat, no signs of anything passing through. Still, that sound had shaken me. I debated hiking out early, but part of me didn't want to look like a coward to myself. I had another night planned, and it was a clear day. I figured maybe I'd just been spooked, so I stayed. I kept my knife on my belt the whole time. I made noise as I walked around, gathered wood, filtered water from a little stream nearby. I even built up a bigger fire for the second night. Something about it made me feel safer. As the sun went down, I sat by the fire again, trying to keep my nerves down. The sound hadn't come back all day. I told myself it was nothing, just some strange encounter that was already over. It was around midnight when it happened. I dozed off in the tent, fully clothed, knife still on my belt. I was in that half-awake, half-asleep state when I felt something. It wasn't a noise this time, it was vibration, like heavy, slow steps on the ground. I opened my eyes, holding my breath. Then I heard the breathing. It wasn't mine. It was low, steady, rhythmic, and it was just outside the tent. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just listened, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The breathing was deep, way deeper than a bobcat could make. You could almost feel the size of the lungs making it. Whatever it was, it sniffed around the outside of the tent. I could hear it shifting, leaves crunching, heavy pads pressing into the ground. My hand closed around the knife under the sleeping bag, but I didn't make a sound. I didn't want to spook it. I didn't want to make it curious. After what felt like forever, the breathing stopped. The footsteps moved away, slow, deliberate. I waited, counting in my head, until I hit 60. Then another 60. I finally unzipped the tent just a few inches and peeked out. The fire was almost out, just glowing embers now. I couldn't see anything, but I didn't feel alone. I stayed in the tent until the first light broke through the trees. When I stepped out, I checked the area again, and this time I found prints. Big ones, bigger than anything I'd seen out there before. They were wide, round, and spaced far apart. I dropped down and measured one with my hand. It was nearly as big as my open palm. I knew right then it had to be a cougar, a real one. That morning I packed up fast. No coffee, no breakfast, just tore the tent down, rolled everything up half-assed, and stuffed it into the pack. I kept looking over my shoulder as I hiked out. I felt watched the whole way. I didn't stop once, not even to catch my breath. Back at the truck, I loaded everything up and got in, locking the doors before I even started it. I sat there for a minute, breathing hard, staring at the trees like I expected to see a pair of eyes watching from the brush. I didn't tell anyone right away. I didn't want to hear the jokes about bobcats or how I was imagining things. But later, I did some reading. Turns out, cougars or mountain lions, whatever name you prefer, do still live in some parts of the Appalachians. People don't see them much because they're ghosts in the forest. They're careful, quiet, calculated. But sometimes they come close. That trip changed the way I looked at the woods. I still go out, but I'm not careless anymore. I carry bear spray now. I make sure people know where I'm going. I don't camp solo as deep as I used to, and I never, ever assume I'm alone out there. It's funny. I used to laugh at the idea of being scared of anything in the woods. But now, every time I hear something break a branch in the distance or catch movement out of the corner of my eye, I think back to that breathing outside my tent. The size of those prints. The silence that followed me all the way out. And I remember that out there, you're just another animal. One that might not be at the top of the food chain after all. The weather hadn't looked great from the start. I knew that going into the weekend, but I had already packed everything up, and I was looking forward to the peace that only comes with being out in the woods, miles away from cell service, cars, and people in general. I had been feeling burned out for a while. Work had been bleeding into my nights. I was getting less sleep. I was constantly on edge. A few days in the woods sounded like exactly what I needed to recalibrate. I didn't even care if it rained the whole time. Just being out there was the whole point. I took my dad's old tent out of the basement the night before. He hadn't used it in years, but I remembered him and I camping in it when I was a kid. It was one of those old dome-style ones, heavy canvas, metal zippers, the works. Solid, if not exactly modern. I figured as long as the rainfly still held up, I'd be just fine. The cooler was one my grandfather had passed down. It was this old green steel Coleman, the kind you basically couldn't kill. It held the cold longer than anything made today, even if it weighed a ton. I brought that too. Honestly, it felt more like I was taking family along than gear. I didn't say that out loud to anyone because it sounded kind of corny, but I definitely felt it. I guess that's why I was so stubborn about not leaving them behind when things went sideways. I drove up to the site early Friday afternoon. It was a few miles off the main road, down a dirt track that didn't see much traffic. I had camped there a couple of times before. There were no official campsites, just a clearing by a creek with a bit of flat ground and a stone fire ring someone had built years back. It was perfect. The trees were tall and thick on all sides, and once you got out of your car and killed the engine, the silence was something you could almost feel pressing against your ears. I got the tent up before it started drizzling. The sky had that soft, gray look that told you the rain wasn't in any hurry to pass, but it wasn't going to come down hard either. Just steady, misty, and a little chilly. I didn't mind. I got everything set up the way I liked. Camp chair, food hung up high from a tree branch, dry wood tucked under a plastic sheet, and my sleeping bag rolled out inside the tent. I kept things neat and simple. I'd brought a little propane stove since building a fire was probably a lost cause with the wet conditions. I made some coffee, then just sat there for a while, listening to the rain hit the leaves. The first night went fine. Nothing special, just cold and damp. I had a book and a small lantern, and I lay there for a while listening to the wind and the occasional creak of trees shifting. There was something about that kind of night that made your mind wander, but I kept mine grounded. I wasn't spooked, just alone. That was the point. I fell asleep a little after midnight. The next morning, the rain had stopped but left the world soaked. I walked a little ways down the creek and then followed a deer trail through the woods for a while. The air was thick with moisture, and everything smelled like wet pine and mud. I saw fresh tracks here and there. Deer, maybe a raccoon. I made some coffee again and sat for a while with the stove hissing. The clouds never cleared. I didn't even see a patch of blue sky all day. I kept the book nearby, mostly just reading and resting. That night, though, something felt different. I'd gone to bed around the same time. I double-checked that the cooler was latched and the food bag was hung. I had this small habit of running through the same mental checklist before I zipped up the tent for the night. I wasn't afraid of bears, not really, but raccoons could do a number on your stuff if you weren't careful. Once everything was squared away, I got into the sleeping bag and turned off the lantern. It was probably around 2 a.m. when I woke up. No noise had woken me up, at least I didn't think so. It was dead quiet. Too quiet, in that way you don't usually notice until it hits you all at once. No wind. No creaking trees, not even the drip of rain off the branches. I remember blinking in the dark and just listening. Nothing. I didn't feel scared, exactly, but something felt off, like the world had paused. I laid there for maybe 10 minutes, just listening, eyes wide open in the dark. And then, from somewhere out in the woods to the left of the tent, I heard a sound. It was quick, but it cut through the silence like a blade. It sounded like someone stepping on a stick and shifting their weight. Just a short crack. I didn't move. My breathing stayed shallow. I reached out slowly and grabbed the flashlight next to my sleeping bag. I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to cast light into the tent and make myself a silhouette. I just waited. Nothing followed. No more sounds, no lights, nothing moving outside. After a while, I started to think maybe it had been a branch falling. Or a deer. Maybe I was just letting my imagination spin out a bit because of how still everything had been. I eventually drifted back to sleep. In the morning, I stepped out of the tent and immediately noticed something that made my gut drop. The cooler was gone. At first, I thought maybe I just placed it somewhere else. I walked around the site. I even checked the brush behind some trees, but it was gone. Not just tipped over or dragged, completely gone. And this thing was heavy, full of food, ice, steel-bodied. It wasn't something a raccoon could carry off. I saw some disturbed grass and a faint trail where something had been dragged off through the wet undergrowth, but the tracks didn't make much sense. They weren't deep, and they didn't look like animal prints, just impressions from something heavy being pulled. I started to get a bad feeling. I told myself maybe a bear had messed with it, and maybe it rolled downhill or something, but that wasn't right either. There was no slope, nothing to roll down, and a bear would have left claw marks or torn into it. There'd be signs, but there was nothing. I spent the rest of the morning scanning the woods and keeping close to camp. I didn't see anyone. No hikers, no campers, no rangers. I thought about leaving then. I was down to some dry snacks and water at that point anyway, but I kept thinking about the tent and the cooler. I wasn't going to just leave them. I didn't want to pack up in a panic and ditch stuff that had belonged to my family. It was sentimental, yeah, but it was more than that too. I didn't want to let the fear make that call for me. By late afternoon, I made up my mind to head out in the morning. I still had enough daylight to manage things if I needed to, but I wanted to be sure I wasn't just overreacting. I had a fire going, not a big one, just enough to keep the area lit a bit as the sun went down. I didn't sit down to read. I didn't really do much of anything. I just sat in the camp chair with the flashlight nearby and waited for the sun to go away. Nothing happened that night. Not a sound. Not a branch. Not a whisper of wind. Just stillness again. I barely slept. When I woke up in the morning, I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the fog. That's when I saw it. The cooler was back. It was sitting right where it had been before. No scratches, no dents, still latched. I walked over slowly, and when I touched it, it felt cold. I opened it. My food was gone, but otherwise it looked untouched. There were no marks on the ground nearby, no tracks, no note, nothing. That was it for me. I didn't panic. I didn't start running around. I just calmly started breaking down the site. Sleeping bag, stove, chair. Tent last. I packed up slow but steady. The whole time I was moving, I felt watched. Not like someone was right there, but more like someone had been there recently. I kept looking into the tree line, expecting to see someone step out, but it never happened. When I finished packing everything but the tent, I hesitated. That old canvas was soaked and heavy, but I wasn't going to leave it. It was my dad's. Same for the cooler. It was my grandfather's. I felt responsible, like I had a duty to bring them home. I didn't care how uncomfortable I felt. I was going to do it. I popped the trunk and tossed in everything but those two items. The tent was staked down and half covered in mud. I was probably out of the car for maybe 2 minutes, just pulling it up, balling it together, and stuffing it in the back with the cooler. And in those 2 minutes, while I was crouched by the car, I heard something that made every hair on my body stand up. From somewhere in the woods, maybe 50 yards out, I heard a breath. Just one. Not a cough, not a word. Just a long, drawn-in breath. Slow and steady. Then nothing. No movement. No sound of someone walking away, just silence again. I didn't look toward it. I didn't freeze. I just stood up, slammed the trunk shut, got in the driver's seat, and turned the key. The car started up just fine. I didn't peel out. I drove down the dirt road like I was taking a Sunday drive. Slow, calm, but my eyes were in the rearview mirror the whole way. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again, and I didn't take a deep breath until I got past the last curve and saw the highway stretching out in front of me. I never found out who or what took the cooler or brought it back. I never found out who made that sound in the woods, but I think it was someone, person, and they'd been close. That was the last time I camped alone in that spot, or anywhere too far off the road, for that matter. I still have the cooler and the tent. They're both stored away in my garage now. Sometimes I think about tossing them. We had been planning the trip for a few weeks. It wasn't some big wilderness adventure or a long trek out into the unknown. It was just supposed to be a quiet weekend at a campsite near a national forest about 2.5 hours from where we lived. Nothing fancy, just a chance to unplug, get away from traffic and noise, and wake up to the sound of birds instead of car alarms. The kind of trip people do all the time. I had been the one to suggest it. Things had been busy lately. Between work and apartment stress, I just wanted to step away from it all. My boyfriend, Saond, was totally on board. He'd grown up doing a lot of hiking and camping with his family, and I liked how calm and grounded he was about everything. He always knew how to handle himself outdoors. He didn't act macho or anything, but he had a quiet confidence that made me feel safer, like I could relax more knowing he was there. We packed light but smart. A good tent, sleeping bags, water filter, portable stove, headlamps, bear spray, a small cooler with some food that wouldn't spoil fast, and the basics, first aid kit, emergency whistle, multi-tool. We were driving his hybrid hatchback, which had good mileage and made it easy to get to these more remote areas without feeling like we were guzzling gas. It wasn't off-roading material, but the forest road wasn't too rough either. We checked reviews of the site beforehand, and it looked peaceful. Not too many people, but not completely isolated either. We got there late Friday afternoon. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows through the trees as we parked and walked the gear a couple hundred yards to the site. There were a few other cars parked along the road nearby, but the sites were spaced far apart enough that it still felt private. You could hear faint voices now and then, but not clearly. Just enough to remind you that other people were around somewhere, which felt comforting, especially that first night. Our campsite was tucked just off a narrow path, surrounded by tall pines and hardwoods. The forest floor was soft with pine needles and leaves, and there was a small clearing for the tent and fire ring. Everything smelled clean: wood, dirt, tree sap. No trash, no noise, no pressure. We set up quickly. Saond handled the tent like he could do it in his sleep, and I got the food situation sorted. By dusk, we had everything squared away. We ate a simple dinner, some rice and beans we heated up on the stove, and sat out under the stars until the cool started to creep in. We didn't bother making a fire. We were tired, and the temperature was dropping fast. Plus, it had been dry lately, and there were warnings posted about fire safety. By the time we zipped into the tent and crawled into our sleeping bags, everything was quiet except for the wind high up in the trees and the occasional distant rustle. I remember thinking how nice it was to feel like we were truly away from it all. No reception, no pings or alerts, just the soft sounds of nature around us. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. No dream, no clear reason, just snapped awake. That moment where you lie still and listen, trying to figure out what your body picked up on before your brain caught up. I didn't say anything. I didn't even move at first, just listened. Then Saond stirred beside me. I heard the soft shift of his sleeping bag as he turned his head, like he'd woken up too. That's when we heard it. It was a loud crack, not a twig snapping. This was deeper, thicker, like a branch being snapped clean in half with force. Not close, but not far either, maybe 50 yards away. Then, just a few seconds later, another sound, harder to place, almost like something heavy stepping onto damp ground. A shuffle and thud at the same time. Then silence. I didn't breathe. I just lay there, completely still, hoping whatever it was wouldn't come closer. My heart was pounding. Saond didn't move either. We hadn't spoken, but I knew he was awake. Both of us just listening, holding our breath. Another sound, quieter but closer. Not footsteps exactly, more like movement, something pushing slowly through underbrush. At this point, every part of me was telling me to get up, run, do something, but logic overruled panic. We didn't know what it was. An animal, probably. A deer, a bear, maybe even a wild pig or a moose passing through. But then again, animals didn't usually make that kind of deliberate noise unless they were large or curious. It moved again, stopping and starting, like it was circling, but not in a full loop, just shifting its position. We heard a scrape, like bark being scratched or maybe something rubbing against a tree. Saond finally, very slowly, reached for the bear spray. I could hear the soft rustle of the nylon holster. Still no talking, just small, slow movements. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went still again. No footsteps, no cracking branches, no rustling, just the wind. We lay there for what felt like forever. 10 minutes? 20? We weren't going to sleep again, that much was clear. Finally, after what seemed like enough time had passed, we sat up, quietly unzipped the tent. The cold hit immediately, and our breath puffed in the dim air. The moon was out, giving the forest a silver blue glow. It was beautiful and at the same time eerie. Still no sound. We scanned around with our headlamps. Nothing. The trees stretched out into the dark, motionless. No eyes reflecting back at us. No shapes in the underbrush. But that didn't mean nothing had been there. Saond motioned gently with his head. He wanted to check around the perimeter of the site. We didn't stray more than 15 or 20 feet in any direction, but we didn't see anything. No fresh prints we could clearly identify, though the pine needles made it hard to tell. We did notice one odd thing, though. A thick branch had snapped off a tree about 7 feet off the ground. Fresh break. Green wood still exposed. I didn't like that at all. We went back into the tent, zipped it up, and sat there. Not lying down, just sitting. It was maybe 3 a.m. by then. We stayed like that until the faintest light started to filter through the trees. And even then, we packed fast. Everything into the car. We didn't even eat breakfast. Just got everything in place and left as soon as we could. We didn't talk until we were halfway down the forest road. It felt like once we hit pavement again, something unclenched in both of us. Saond finally said something like, "That wasn't normal." I nodded, because it wasn't. We tried to piece together what it could have been. It wasn't a deer. They don't move like that. It didn't sound like a bear either. Too quiet, too deliberate, and it didn't come sniffing around for food. Whatever it was had stopped moving the moment we made noise. Back home, I thought I'd feel better. I showered, made tea, tried to watch something light, but something kept gnawing at me. It wasn't just the sounds, it was that we both woke up at the same exact time. Like some deep instinct we didn't even understand had flipped a switch inside both of us. I thought about that branch. Snapped clean off, too high for a person unless they jumped or used something. But why break it? What would do that in the middle of the night so close to a camp? A week passed then too. The feeling didn't fade as much as I hoped. Every time I thought back on it, I got that same deep unease in my chest. We'd camped before and heard normal forest sounds. Coyotes, owls, even a bobcat once in the distance. But this had been different. Saond eventually admitted he had grabbed his knife too that night, just in case. Neither of us had said anything at the time, but we both had the same thoughts. Something wasn't right. I went back online and checked forums about the area. A few scattered posts, people hearing weird things, a couple folks mentioning broken branches in weird spots, some claiming to have found torn-up campsites with no clear cause. Most brushed it off. Animals, storms, careless hikers. But enough people had that same tone. That same, I don't know what it was, but it wasn't normal feeling. We haven't camped since. It's not that I'm scared of the woods. I'm scared of the things people don't talk about. The stuff that doesn't make it into safety brochures. I'm scared of how quickly peace and quiet can shift into something else entirely. And how, sometimes, you don't even realize you're being watched until it's too late. We got lucky. We didn't try to confront it. Didn't try to chase it off or figure it out. We just stayed quiet, got low, and listened. And when the time came, we left. Maybe that's what made the difference. We were smart enough to not try to prove anything. We just got the hell out.